Welcome to Energy Unplugged, your go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. I'm Oliver Kerr, Aurora's Managing Director for North America. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Sandhya Ganapathy, CEO of EDP Renewables North America. Sandhya also has a unique global perspective, having spent several years as global head of investments in M&A. And on top of that, she has many years in investment banking across many geographies. So in short, she knows both US and global power markets inside out. Sandhya, welcome. We're very delighted to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Pleasure is absolutely mine.
So I'd like to start with a very general question. You're the CEO of one of the largest renewables companies in the US. When you look at the state of the market right now, what is top of mind for you?
I think when I look at the US market, over the last, I would say 15, 20 years, the growth of renewables has been astronomical. We are now almost 20% of the overall energy mix. And so really, really contributing to the overall energy needs of the economy. And this growth in demand has been spurred by a few things. I think number one, US, in many states of the country, almost 30 different states, there are what we call as renewable portfolio standards, which mandate the load-serving entities or the local utilities in order to procure clean power. Number two, of course, we are talking about, an aging thermal fleet. And so there are coal retirements and replacement of that by cleaner forms of energy. So renewables is very much in demand. And number three, and the biggest one, which actually distinguishes US from the rest of the world, is such a sophisticated, deep, wonderful corporate PPA market. And that's not just driven by ESG standards and requirements and mandates of these companies, but also the desire to lock in energy cost for the long run. And today, there is no form of energy other than renewables, which can offer you a long-term fixed stable price, call it 20, 25, 30 years. And that is very important for some of these countries. So what really excites me is definitely the growth in demand that we are seeing, of course, over the last 12, 18, 24 months. We all know the big buzzword is AI, and of course, the energy consumption that will be required by these data centers, which effectively means more power needs for the economy, and different sources of power and energy is absolutely the need of the hour. On the other hand, I would say we do have, broad challenges, which are very structural, challenges, which I think you will find in most markets, such as interconnection challenges around transmission. And all these are further accentuated because of this, super increasing, ever increasing growth that we are seeing now, which, honestly was almost flat till recent because, you have growth in demand, but also you have energy efficiency. So I know that was a very long answer, but on balance, I would say what excites me is the demand. What worries me is the structural challenges that we have on the ground in order to, put electrons into the grid.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think it's interesting. The demand is huge. And I think when I look in the US and compare that to what's going on in Europe, it feels almost like a lot of the European demand is very mandate driven and top down. And in the US, like you said, there are corporate demand. There is just the economics are very good, and you have subsidies that make the renewables very attractive. So it feels quite different in terms of what is driving some of that investment. I mean, the US is obviously huge. When you think about capital allocation across different US markets, different regions, different geographies, what are some of the main factors that you're considering? I mean, are there particular markets that you find especially attractive right now from an investment perspective?
So today we have a fleet of a bit more than 10 gigawatts of operating capacity. And that's predominantly wind. I would say 75% is wind, but we also have a very growing and fast growing solar and storage portfolio. We are present in 21 states in the country. And so across ISOs, across markets, BGM, MISO, CAISO, WEC, SPP, NISO, ERCOT. So we are there, almost, everywhere where the resource is attractive and where it makes sense. I think, we don't have a defined approach of focusing too much in any ISO because we do draw from the benefits of diversification from a resource perspective, diversification from a portfolio perspective. Of course, However, we are seeing a huge growth in demand, and we have been witnessing this over the last, I would say, 5, 7, 10 years, particularly in PJM and MISO, which is further getting accentuated now with, a lot of the data center demand, because where effectively you see demand growth is essentially, I mean, just look at Virginia, for example, almost 70% of the global data, fiber optics or rather, sort of data center demand is concentrated in some pockets. So definitely we are seeing much more. But when I'm thinking about capital allocation, we are looking at it across. We are looking for places where we have better transmission, where it is cheaper to connect, places where the resource is fantastic, places where it is from a permitting standpoint, it is relatively easier compared to others. And so it's not just one factor. I think geographical diversification is important for us, but equally important is the fact that we, as a company, we address both the corporate PPA as well as the utility market. And so we are very broad-based.
Yeah, I think particularly on the interconnection and permitting side, that is something that's been a hot topic in the last year or two. Are there some markets that make that easier than others? I mean, or maybe to put it another way, there have been several attempts to make interconnection processes more efficient and smoother and get through the backlog of projects. Some of those have been federal with FERC Order 2023. Some of them have been state or ISO level. How optimistic are you feeling that we've got the balls rolling to solve some of these issues across different regions?
Well, am I optimistic? I wouldn't use the word optimistic, Oliver, to be honest, because there is so much more work that is to be done on the ground. I think I'm definitely hopeful, okay? Because look, today, no matter which ISO you take, I think the number of megawatts which are in the queue waiting for interconnection is much more than the total installed capacity. And that's a challenge in itself. Because the demand is there. I think it is acknowledged by every single, ISO that the demand is there. There have been situations because of, extreme weather conditions where, ISOs have also been, worried about blackouts and so, structurally a lot more needs to be done. Of course, there have been a greater push in order to streamline some of the permitting, in order to streamline particularly the interconnection in terms of whether it is, progressing the studies or the mandate to go for dynamic line rating systems, etc. But much more needs to be done. I mean, the reality is, let's acknowledge, the grid that we have today was never designed for this kind of demand. And so we have a very aging grid. The infrastructure we have not done enough reinforcement over time. Plus, you have this massive spurt of, increase in growth. And so no matter which form of energy you wish to connect to the grid, I do think, we have that fundamental problem. So, so sitting on, a manifold times current installed capacity from a queue position perspective is never a good thing. It's never a good thing for any economy. And you mentioned Europe. I think in different parts of Europe, we also see the same. But I think what we see in the US is probably, it takes the icing. And so, so I'm hopeful. But a lot needs to be done, and it needs to be done really, really fast. And we know we need to, we talk about AI, from a demand perspective, but I also think that we can use AI as a tool in order to push through some of these processes. Like, for example, using AI-based approaches in order to fasten, in order to accelerate the, the interconnection study, so that these queues can be granted. Today, it takes us anywhere between 5 to 7 to 8 years to get a project from start to finish, and that is unacceptable. Yes, in some markets it's better. ERCOT is, much faster compared to the other markets because of the way, interconnection is granted. But that is also, part of the reason why we almost have 40% of ERCOT's power is coming from clean energy, right? And ERCOT also allows, more projects to be built. But having said that, I think, PJM and MISO and CAISO are taking steps, but that's not enough. Much more needs to be done.
No, I think it's a really interesting time in the US right now. And on top of all of that context, we have a new administration. At the time of recording, we've just seen a flurry of executive orders affecting different parts of the energy transition. We are still digesting them and yet to pass through them in detail. But I'm curious to get your views on how the change in administration plays into all of this. I suppose if I were to summarize our view, it's probably one of cautious optimism, in part because of some of the trends you just mentioned. The demand growth is expected to be rapid. Interconnection queues are taking a long while to get through. But, the fundamentals are good. We need more power on the system. And so, in that context, we have in that context, I think it makes sense. We think we're relatively optimistic about the prospect for generation, including renewables in the US going forward. I'm curious to get your take on how this all interacts.
I think one thing, for me, as you rightly mentioned, underlies everything, which is the administration is very conscious of the fact that we are in an era of ever-increasing power demand. And for economic development, for manufacturing to flourish here, for supply chain to be domestic, and for us to, sort of have a very robust economic system here, the fundamental thing is to be energy secure. And to be energy secure, you need all forms of energy. And as I said, renewables is front and center. It is a significant part of the overall energy mix. But also, let's not forget that renewables is also probably one of the only forms of energy which can be put, faster, which can come into from a fruition, from a completion perspective, which can be connected fastest to the grid from start to completion. And so we need, to embrace an all sources of energy approach, which is what at least we are seeing on the ground. And then it is still too early. So we will just wait and watch in terms of how the administration is viewing different pockets of energy and different pockets of, renewable energy also. But at least from a company perspective on the ground, we are seeing fantastic demand. We're continuing to see that. Mm-hmm. And the country needs more energy. And it's not about A versus B. It is A and B. I think we are all complements and we are all required in order to make the country sustainable and energy sufficient.
Mm. I mean, to what extent do you think the energy transition is actually dependent on federal policy, or is there an argument to be made that a lot of the heavy lifting can be done at ISO and state level?
No, I think you need it's all hands on deck. You need all stakeholders for the transition. There is a reason why we call it transition, right? It's not overnight, and it takes time. It takes time in order because you're changing the map of the power mix, as well as you're catering to the growing demand. And so that takes, all stakeholders. It takes definitely policy is important from a federal perspective. Capital needs certainty. So from that perspective, policy is absolutely critical. Capital also needs execution certainty on the ground, which is where you need you need ISOs and RTOs coming up with bold steps, coming up with disruptive, ways of doing things, so that we are able to address the demand. End of the day, all these stakeholders are equally responsible in order to ensure that the country is sufficient from an energy secure. And so yes, I think it's not just the ISOs, RTOs. It is even at the state level, even at the county level, whoever is responsible for getting the project done from a permitting and from a agency perspective. Of course, the policy gives us a canvas and the comfort and the certainty for investments to flourish. This has to be a truly private-public partnership, and so you need all stakeholders on board.
Fully agreed. And you need a stable policy landscape in which to make long-term investment decisions. One of the things we've been spending quite a lot of time on lately is how much of this projected load growth from things like AI and data centers is hype and how much is reality. And I'm sure you're thinking through the same things. You've sat on investment committees. So if your commercial team brings you a project investment thesis, and that's based on a very high projection for load growth, let's say they've aggregated individual system operator load forecasts, they've taken them at face value in PJM. How much of a haircut are you applying to those load growth forecasts? How much of it do you actually bank into your investment thesis?
That's a very, very interesting question. I think it goes into the heart of, sort of our investment thesis, as well as that of the corporates when they're demanding, because, today we are seeing 15-year PPAs. We are also seeing an uptick in the demand for 20-year PPAs or 25-year PPAs, which to me is a signal that the market is expecting or forecasting, higher power prices down the road in the future. And when we look at investments, definitely we have our own internal views, for sure. We also have views from, third parties such as yourself as well. Of course, that plays a big role into how we are evaluating things. But also we are very much on the ground talking to key stakeholders, of course, talking to people like the ISOs, RTOs. They all come up with, their projections. We talk significantly to utilities. Of course, the IRPs of the utility may give you a near-term horizon, but definitely they are there, looking at the economic activity in their backyard and how they can, how they can feed into it in the long run. We also talk a lot to the customers in terms of what they are seeing. So I think it's a blended approach of our own view of the market, what we are definitely, hearing and reading and seeing and talking and getting from research houses, RTOs, ISOs, the customers, and definitely, definitely the economic projections in terms of, growth. So when we really talk about AI, for example, nowadays, you have, forecast galore, right? Right from 5 to 8% growth. Somewhere I read that the demand over the next 5 years in the US will be very similar to the actual amount of power that is consumed by Germany today. I don't know whether that's right or wrong. So you have, you have different, you see what I mean? You have different spectrums and different bookends. So one, of course, from an input perspective into our models, definitely we consider all that, but we also sensitivize things, right? We also want to look at downside cases. We also want to see what if things don't materialize, and what if it's the other end? Are we leaving value on the table? So we'll have to, we look at all those things, and it's a very fundamentals approach, but also there is a very market or a customer feedback approach integrated into it.
Mm-hmm. And I think you make a great point around the tenor of PPAs. I think when distinguishing hype from reality, often looking at actual revealed preferences is helpful, and the fact that demand for longer term 15, 20-year PPAs is increasing is, it's people putting their money where their mouths is.
Yeah.
But putting money on the line. I mean, yeah, you mentioned the next 5 years. Well, I'm curious, given some of the challenges around interconnection queues, if we do start to see some of those higher projections from load growth, do you see a material chance of certain regions being short on power over the next few years? Or is it more a case of, the power isn't there, so the demand won't come?
It's hard to say, because you cannot tell whether it's AI or whether it's manufacturing. You cannot tell them that, wait, it will take me another 15, 20 years in order to build a XYZ power plant, in order to provide you the access to the power. It's hard to sort of put guardrails around that. Economic activity will happen. And then the question is, how do we structurally make some disruptive changes, which I already referred to, based on this demand, so that the economy is not suffering just because you didn't prepare it well enough in order to, absorb this increasing economic demand or increasing power demand. And so to me, it's more of a chicken and egg. But the very positive that I'm seeing nowadays, amount of, for lack of better word, influence, or the close collaboration that we are seeing between some of the hyperscalers, the big tech, and the large corporates, which are really driving this demand with the utilities on the ground, and how the utilities are taking that into account in their IRPs, and how that is also feeding into how they think about transmission upgrades, and how they are thinking about investing in order to sort of reinforce, you see what I mean, the existing system, so that more projects can come online faster. And that I don't think used to happen in the past. So that is definitely a welcome change, because the consumer is very active in ensuring today that that they will be able to have line of sight on the energy requirements, and that is also all this is also factoring in how we are looking at power prices in the future, which is the expectation of not just the demand, but the expectation of how the supply is going to pan out, and what structural reforms are required on the ground or can be expected on the ground in order to support that. So if I look at the next 5 years, will a lack of power be a derailer? Possibly, yes, if we are not able to push through some of the reforms that we're talking now. I think FERC needs to be much more empowered in order to do their mandate, and they need to be much more directional to the various ISOs, RTOs in terms of what they need to do. And we are already seeing the close collaboration between the utilities and the consumers, and that needs to, continue, and that influence on from the demand side need to continue in order to ensure that we are able to bring structural improvements.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's a new trend we're seeing really of the closer coordination between the load side and the generation side.
Yep.
And it matters, right? Because exactly how much demand growth you see playing through into the market depends on how much generation is, but how much of this is behind the meter as well. So
Yep.
how much of the demand brings their own project. So I'm curious to get your views on that. We've seen some big announcements around partnerships recently with
Yep.
the data centers and big tech partnering with renewables developers to build, wind, solar batteries to supply the asset. We've also seen, or starting to see at least, a lot of backup generation on site, which is normally gas. I'm wondering how much of the data centers will be bringing their own supply, if you like, and how much of it is simply, additional demand on the grid.
No, that's a great question. And one of the things which is different, when we think about data centers versus the rest, is the need for that seamless 24/7 power, right? They need access to the power. And so effectively, we should look at ways in which, you talked about behind the meter. We talked about, or what is even more important is ensuring that there is backup generation. I think two things are equally important. One, the data centers need to have access to 24/7. That's a given. Number two, however, that power should also be affordable to them, right? Because if 60, 70, 80% of the cost of your cost composition is really power, it matters. And that's why we are seeing data centers in one area versus the other, because the cost of power is ultimately what is driving them to be in one location versus the other. And so also it's very important that when they're doing it, they're also very, very clear that they want to do it in a very sustainable way. And so you cannot talk about AI on one side, and AI, which should help in the advancement of, society in very many ways, whether it is in medicine, whether it's in manufacturing, whether it's in our cost of living, or whether it's in the way we, whatever, right? AI contributing to the growth and to the betterment of humanity on one side. And on the other side, you cannot pollute the grid, and cannot result in, more emissions. So both those don't hand in hand. And so you have to work around these three pillars of security, which is the 24/7 that we talked about, affordability, which is pricing, and number three, that is sustainability. And so, yes, we are seeing a lot more. We will continue to see a lot more of those deals. And you're also seeing a lot more deals of data centers with renewable projects or renewable sponsors, massive deals. We are seeing such an increase in uptick in demand for our projects in places where, which are very crucial for them. Also supplemented either by backup generation or supplemented by, you see what I mean, behind the meter, batteries, which they can have on their own site. And so yes, we are going to see much more novel, much more innovative, much more creative ways. And I think, I keep using this word, but for me, I think, we cannot get to energy sufficiency by following status quo. You need to think disruptively. You need to think in a big way. You need to think out of the box, and you need to and you need to be open and flexible for all forms of energy and bringing all forms of novel solutions and, creative solutions. I mean, at some point of time, we had talked about, and one of the things I think which Europe is doing far ahead of the US is hybrid technologies, where on the very same side, you're putting wind and solar and batteries, so that you're almost creating a 24/7 profile with renewables. And, embracing hybridization is very key to a market like the US as well, because again, going back to my statement, I think we need all forms of energy, but also we have to ensure that these electrons are able to connect the fastest to the grid. We do not have time to wait. And so renewables definitely score very high on that, as well as very high on ensuring that you're able to give price visibility.
Yeah, and that trilemma of affordability, reliability, and sustainability is, it's hard in any market. And I think we're especially seeing that play out in this data center conversation. When we run the numbers across different US regions, it doesn't take a whole lot, given that, power is 70, 80% of the cost base, like you say, to push the economics, and given the sort of load profiles, to push the economics in favor of, let's say, self-supply from a new build gas plant, as opposed to, a hybrid structure. And, the benefit is you can also get it up and running quicker, rather than waiting for, projects to be built and come through, given delays in interconnection queues. To what extent do you think that this trend threatens to derail the energy transition in that sense?
Yeah, I don't think, if you're specifically referring to the trend of not having enough projects, if you're specifically referring to the trend that that renewables or data centers really need a 24/7, and the question of renewables and intermittency, that is a derailer, I really don't think so. And again, as I said, we used to, gone are the days when we are using 2-hour batteries. Today we are using 4 hours, we're looking at 8 hours. And, as technology evolves, probably we'll have longer duration storage on one side. But I think fundamentally, going back to my point around hybridization, renewables is not just wind, it's not just solar. You can bring all of these together so that you create, a generation profile which is very much in line with what the customer or the data center expects. Of course, you can have a baseload protection. Of course, you have a backup. But that you need, Oliver, I would also question, there have been situations where thermal plants have not been able to perform because of weather events, whereas the turbines, were spinning. And so we do need all forms of energy. I think each one can be a backup for the other. And so if you're asking me, is that a derailer? I wouldn't call that as a derailer, so long as we are able to have regulations which embrace the adoption of all technologies, which are much more, how would I say, much more in line with how do you actually meet the energy needs versus, well, this is what was written in a tariff which was established 30 years back. You see what I mean? And so that adoption and adjustment of regulations and tariffs to the existing market conditions, existing demand patterns, I think that is fundamental, and also existing forms of energy. Right. And so once you have that, I think we will have a long success story here.
Yeah, no, I think the regulation piece is absolutely key there. When taking a step back to think about the market more generally, it's, the US feels like a very competitive market right now in terms of, developer, owner, operators of assets. When you're thinking about EDPR or just the market more generally, what are some of the major capabilities or sources of competitive advantage that you think will make most difference to big developers over the next 10 years in the US?
Yeah. So we have been present in the US since 2007. And, of course, globally, we are present in, 20 plus countries today. And more than half of our, installed capacity group wide is in the US. And so fundamentally, this is a very, very, very attractive market for us. I think what has enabled us to get to this point of scale is the fact that, one, definitely that ability to have a very diversified focus. So we are not just focusing on any one state or any one ISO or RTO. We are very, very much diversified. And number two is that, sort of that approach to building a good project pipeline, depending upon resource, depending upon transmission, depending upon our sort of the load growth and the demand that is coming from. Number three, definitely being a large player, of course, you have the strength of the balance sheet, and that enables you to weather, sort of the different economic cycles and patterns. But more importantly, I think it is also the quality and skill of people. I think people it's a big differentiator between one versus the other, especially in a very competitive and a very fast-growing industry such as ours. The renewable sector is fast-growing. It's also a young sector relative to many others that we are talking about. And so the quality of people and that definitely is a differentiator. And so I would say, and to me, these will continue going forward. I think the one other element that I would add to it is, how are we embracing and adapting, all the new technologies that are coming? Are you in, multiple technologies versus single-use technologies? How are you embracing AI to sort of increase your efficiency and the way you site projects, for example, the way you, sort of maintain your assets, for example, the way you do weather forecasting, for example? All these are sort of competitive advantage. I mean, just to give you an example, nowadays, the offtakes are so sophisticated that you really want to have a very good sense of weather patterns. You want to have a very good sense of what you're going to do or what you're going to produce tomorrow, the day ahead market, and that forecasting, the robustness and, the precision with which you're able to forecast all of that, it matters. And so as as we are entering into a phase, the next phase of the sector where we are now an almost mature sector and a mature industry, I think, every single way of being able to optimize at scale, that makes a huge difference. So I would say a combination of all these: people having the right projects, having the right processes, having the right pipeline, having the right balance sheet, having the right, sort of digital approach, and above all, being flexible and being adaptive to the changing market environment.
No, so, given those advantages, scale, diversification, the human capacity, the people, and in-house capabilities. To what extent do you think we'll see more consolidation in the market? We've seen a lot of newer, smaller development shops enter the market over the last few years off the back of IRA funding. Will we see more consolidation in the market over the next few years through M&A?
I do think so. I think the last 3-4 years we saw some amount of decent consolidation happening. We also saw some of the large European players, or European funds, which, enter the market through acquisition. However, we also are going through a phase where you see the cost of capital is much higher. There is a bit of political uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty around the sector. And so to some extent, that also will be top of mind of people who are actually, thinking about investing here. But I would say, yes, consolidation we should see, which is a natural evolution. I think people who have the balance sheet, people who have the capabilities, people who are able to have attractive cost of capital definitely will dominate in this market. And so we should see consolidation happening. We should also be mindful of the fact that, wind and solar, their evolution is in different stages, trajectory as well. The country has so many solar developers. And so it is such a fragmented market. Obviously, we'll at some phase, these projects, have reached, when the project reaches a point in time where, larger big ticket investments are in demand. Definitely that will be the time when people will be looking for, sort of sponsorship in terms of capital, in terms of balance sheet. And so, yes, so we should say, yes, we are entering into a very, very interesting stage of consolidation, which I think is a natural progression, natural evolution, when you take any industry. So we should also see the same.
Yeah, no, and I think part of the challenge will be at the same time as benefiting from the scale and the breadth, making sure to maintain that depth of expertise and on the ground knowledge in very specific markets, where you really do have to get into the details on specific areas and projects, policies, regulations.
Absolutely. I think the time is to go both go deep and go wide. I know that is that's a conundrum in itself, but that expertise in individual markets, expertise in the depth of expertise is absolutely critical, and consolidation actually can help in that, because on one side you can have really, really folks who have done the projects on the ground, who have gone through the rigors of building projects, and who have experienced the ups and downs. And then you can have the deep pockets, right? So both of them coming together, pockets in terms of capital coming together, will be a great match.
Great. Well, thank you, Sandhya. One of the ways we sometimes like to wrap up episodes is with a quick fire round of under or overrated. So I'm going to give you a quick list of 3 things, and you'll tell me if you think they're either under or overrated. So the first one is the likelihood that wind and solar tax credits will remain intact, relatively intact over the next 4 years.
Yeah, I don't expect it to remain relatively intact. There could be some changes, but I also don't expect it to be completely thrown out of the window.
Yep. The second would be the hype around data center load growth. Is that underrated or overrated?
I wouldn't say it is underrated. However, if we see derailers, definitely, there will be a pause and there will be a revised outlook, I would say.
And finally, the potential for a nuclear renaissance in the US, whether that's traditional nuclear or SMRs.
Yeah, I think it's a bit overrated. We will see at least 10 plus years. We will need at least 10 plus years for nuclear to come in a big way. SMRs, yes. However, we know that, This is, at least our experience in terms of nuclear plants, in terms of cost and schedule, have not been the greatest. And also there are significant challenges, around permitting. And so I think it's a bit overrated in terms of the horizon, in terms of what nuclear can actually contribute to the overall mix.
It does feel like nuclear renaissance is a term that comes up about once every 5 years and then disappears relatively quickly.
Yeah.
But maybe this time is different. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up, Sandhya. Wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, and it was an absolute pleasure and an interesting time indeed, and we'll keep an eye out on what happens.
That was Sandhya Ganapathy, CEO of EDP Renewables North America, talking to Oliver Kerr, Aurora's Managing Director for North America. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow or subscribe to the podcast via whatever platform you use.